Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Cannabis Unlocked. Today, I'm your host, Jordan Youkilis, founding partner of Key Investment Partners, and I'm very excited to be joined by my friend Eric Berlin of Dentons. Eric, how are you doing today?
I am great, Jordan, and I'm really appreciative of the opportunity to speak with you on this forum.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really appreciative of you coming on and sharing your legal expertise as a partner at Dentons and leading the firm's global cannabis practice.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yeah, so with that, why don't we talk about your personal background, your career background, and how you ended up at Dentons?
Yeah, happy to explain the background, and it's an unusual path in some ways. I was a partner at Jones Day prior to coming to Denton's, and there I worked, and this is years ago. So I entered the cannabis space, so to speak, in 2009. And I worked pro bono to help craft and get past the original Illinois medical cannabis law. And it was particularly challenging at the time because it was the first or one of the first bills coming through the legislature as opposed to the ballot box.
Mm.
And so it presented a whole additional host of problems in that we had to negotiate all of the structure up front. It wasn't just legalize. And so it became really a model that's followed in the rest of the country to have a sort of higher level of regulation. It wasn't my intention when we started out to have that. I just wanted to legalize medical cannabis and provide safe, legal, affordable access for those who would benefit from it. But it was what was necessary in Illinois and, quite frankly, most of the Midwest. So then I was brought into Ohio to help. Well, what I did is redraft that bill. It had basically been drafted to fail, and there was a change of spirit midway through, and I was brought in to redraft it, testify before the Senate committee, and help get it passed.
Hmm.
And from there, I mean, that was years of work that I just, like 6 or 7 years of work. At the end, I looked up and really, first of all, felt strongly that I could help in the legalization of cannabis and bringing in the rule of law into the industry. And second, it was still more mom and pop then.
Mhm.
But from my view, from my vantage point, I was able to see how the industry was going to develop, and there was going to be a need for more sophisticated legal services. So along the way, I brought the practice over to Denton's, which is just a phenomenal place for me to be doing it. And that's, well, depending on your perspective, the short or long story as to how I got here.
Wow, that's great. And I'm curious, before you started working in cannabis legislation, I mean, did you have um, a personal interest in cannabis legalization, or was that just kind of circumstantial?
Yeah, I'll tell you something. I mean, it wasn't something I was afraid of when I was younger, but it wasn't really something that was part of my life in any way.
Mhm.
And the reason that I got involved is because, first of all, I have Crohn's disease, and I am very active in fundraising
Mhm.
and advocacy for digestive diseases. I was at the time during overlapping in this, I served as the president of the University of Chicago GI Research Foundation and
Yeah.
still am very involved in that organization, fantastic organization. And what happened was, I mean, I'm going to sound ignorant. I'm now one of the most knowledgeable people about cannabis in the country, but I came a long way. At that point, I asked folks who were involved in the organization and peripheral patients, really, what do you know about people with Crohn's or colitis using cannabis to treat their symptoms? And about half of them at the time looked at me surprised and said, "Aren't you?" And I'll tell you, I just thought it was, once I started speaking to other folks, like a veteran who was honorably discharged from the was ranger for MS, and the only thing that could get him from his bed to his wheelchair in the morning was cannabis. And I thought it was just fundamentally wrong that people like that had to go out on the streets or have unsure sources of cannabis and risk arrest and a loss of job and everything else. It was the first time really in, you know, a long time that kind of got the hair on my back to stand up and say, this is fundamentally unfair, improper, and I'm going to do something about it. I'll tell you though, I mean, at the time, I'm grateful for the partner in charge of the Jones Day office at the time who let me do it. But this is a long time ago. This is before people were talking about it. So when I went and said I'd like to work pro bono to help legalize medical cannabis in Illinois, people thought I had lost my brain. I mean, people were like, "You're out of your mind." And and okay, once they understood it, they supported me in the sense of like, we support that you're doing this, but you're ruining your legal career. The stigma of this will never, be wiped from you, and this is going to be terribly damaging to your career and terribly damaging potentially to the firm. And it was a different world. It was a truly different world. I started when in the elevator, I couldn't, when people say, "What do you do?" I couldn't say it because it was too stigmatizing. Now I can't say it because it's everything everyone wants to talk about.
That's
So,
true. I mean, it's
yeah, so
crazy.
that's the introduction, and I'll just say as a
Yeah.
side, I mean, we're going to talk a lot about the industry and business, and even when there are difficult business decisions to be made. Now, of course, my fiduciary duty, my obligation is to the client, but when we're problem solving, I like to bring up the notion of safe, legal, affordable access for those who would need it. And is this a decision that's going to help that, or is it a decision that's going to hurt that? And it's a good way for me to center myself as I move forward through all the different touch points I have in the industry.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm glad you bring up that aspect of the stigma of getting into the industry, and is that going to ruin your career? And even, when my partners and I joined the industry, that was 2018, and we're like, oh, we're gonna ruin our entire private equity careers, right? If this industry doesn't take off, have we shot ourselves in the foot and all that? And I think it is an important factor that, while it continues to be less of a factor over time, still is there, and I think has been one of the reasons why cannabis has struggled to get high quality operators in. But it's
Right.
getting there day by day.
Some of it's, I confess, just hubris, right? I mean, some of it's when someone says the stigma is going to stick to you and it's going to do damage, and I say I'm going to change that stigma. I have enough credibility and articulate and the mind to go change that. And maybe that's hubris, maybe that's arrogance, maybe it's just being an idiot. But it is the change that happens, right? I mean, it's the
It is.
believing, and it's at every single level, right? I mean, um, it's the folks who are willing to, in a state like Georgia, Alabama, take on the work from another agency. It's the folks who are figuring out how to put capital into the industry, right? I mean, the work you guys are doing is critically important to the industry, and it all takes a little bit of courage, which is some have more than others.
Yeah, sure. And I think what's nice, frankly, is the facts are on our side, right? You look at the benefits on the medical side, what research we do
Right.
have. You look at the true, cultural and political reasonings that went into the war on drugs and the Controlled Substances Act in the first place, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, you do feel like you've truth on your side, and it's somewhat liberating.
totally. So now, as you built out the cannabis practice at Dentons, you guys have certainly become one of the most institutional, largest players in the world of cannabis deal structuring. And so we've had the privilege of getting to work with you on some really great transactions. But I guess just to start, would love to hear what that evolution has looked like internally at Dentons as you built out the cannabis side of the house, rather.
So happy to talk about that. And I'll tell you, it's been a project of a lot of fulfillment of getting folks in the firm to support this, and really best in practice lawyers coming on and helping. And let me talk about that a little bit. When I came on to Dentons, they, my interview process was fairly long, just to say that. And I was interviewing at other places. But what I said was, they said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, what I want to do is, with the other folks, build what would be viewed as the leading cannabis practice in the world. I found, by the way, that, at the time that I was going to different firms, I was at the same time negotiating, like, what are you going to let me do? You know,
Mhm.
there were firms that, there was one firm that said, oh, we were very interested in having a cannabis practice, but we're not going to allow you to do any cannabis transactions. You can't do any deals. And I said, it's lovely meeting you and all, but that's a deal stopper. We can stop this interview now. I'm happy to sit and talk to you for another half hour, but I'm not coming to your firm because that's how I make money in order to do all the stuff that I love to do, like write legislation and think about strategic analysis. So, um, you know, Dentons was read from wire to wire, and that they were fantastic. They bought that vision. They understood what it meant, that it was going to be a legitimate sector, industry sector group,
Mhm.
just like any other. And we were going to build it in a way that was cross geography, cross substantive areas, um, cross generations in lawyers, so that we weren't just going to have the young folks who were interested in cannabis. We're really going to bring in the elder statesmen of the firm to bring their
Mhm.
expertise in. And so what it involved was saying, what are the full slate of services that cannabis companies and cannabis adjacent companies are going to need, and
Yeah.
anticipating that every step of the way, because no company wants you learning on their dime. And so whether doing it, you know, learning it off the clock, or, you know, getting that experience quickly, or bringing in folks who have it. And so what we really did is we take the folks like Joanne Caceres and we then work with the folks in the other substantive areas, whether it's M&A, debt, tax planning, to layer on the cannabis knowledge and work hand in hand with the folks who were more experienced. Did I break up a little bit there?
You did break up a little bit, but I think we caught the vast majority of it.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries.
And so what we really did is take folks who have deep industry knowledge, like super deep, have been, you know, a lot of lawyers have entered the space and have basically disclaimed knowledge of the industry, right? Their firms won't let them get their so-called hands dirty to
Mm.
learn it. And they say, well, and it's a horrible situation. It's partly what this group was created to counter, so that we would have that really deep industry knowledge, and taking folks who have really deep knowledge of their substantive areas, um, ESOPs, right? Taking best in class employment lawyers, layering them on top of the cannabis and cannabis work we do. And all those lawyers have learned themselves and can stand on their own now. Um, we just had a team working. There was a very unfortunate situation in Massachusetts where an employee died, um, allegedly from exposure to cannabis.
Mm.
And so the ability to not just know the regulations, know the industry, but have folks who are, you know, can get in from day one and know how to do that. Same with all the union activity now, and same with all the litigation activity now. And so it was really taking best in class lawyers, bringing them into the group, getting them fully educated, working with folks who have deep industry knowledge, and gaining the buy-in along the way,
Mhm.
Jordan. I mean, to be truthful, I mean, there's a lot of support, but getting, and in many ways, I served as a coach, right? And getting everyone
Sure.
involved and figuring out who the right players are and who has a good, you know, skills, but who's great with the clients, and putting that all together over time with the goal that we can be, you know, mostly a one-stop shop for the more
Mhm.
sophisticated companies in the space, which is not to say we're not, you know, doing the slip and fall case. And there are certainly cases that we say it's kind of small, it might be better off with someone who has lower rates. But for the things that matter to the company, both on an ongoing basis and the really big, you know, bet the company litigation or change your course kind of transaction, uh, part of what we built is the ability to see around corners, for
Yep.
folks not to just do what they're doing and then you just drop them off the cliff, but to do what they're asking and to see all the cannabis implications, both operationally and regulatorily. And I think that's a lot of what we've built to be. And I'll just add to that, have a fair voice in thought leadership in the space
Yeah.
of taking the folks who have this enormous experience across deals, across states, across different industry participants, and just trying to share it with others.
Yeah, I think that's so valuable, and we've certainly benefited from that. And I think it's the kind of thing that we try to certainly do our internally as well. And it's hard to always necessarily know the direct impact of that, but it I think comes back to you in a lot of really positive ways throughout the building up of a platform.
Thank you. I think it's in some ways. I know a lot of folks are really smart about the industry, right? I mean, you folks are really smart about the industry, but in some ways, it's unfair to ask companies. I mean, they have their business to run, and having someone who studies cannabis law like it's Talmud, like I do. I mean, I haven't said that before, but I think it's true. It's a different situation, right? I mean, you guys all have your job to do, but it's our job to be the smartest in the room about cannabis laws and their implications and understanding all those implications. And it's hard to ask folks who are trying to operate a business to be doing that on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, totally. Now I wanted to ask you, what are some of the overarching complications that cannabis businesses face when looking to do M&A and deals?
Oh, okay. There's a lot, Jordan. That's a big question, but here we go. I'll mention some. Um, so first of all, without even getting to the state issues, which I think are in many ways the most important, you do have federal illegality, which means that the whatever the deal is, there are fewer folks who can get involved, right? Whether it's investment bankers, whether it's accountants, whether it's just tax specialists, whether it's folks putting money into or taking money out of the deal, there are just fewer folks because of the federal illegality, which creates its whole host of problems in and of itself and challenges in and of itself. But to me, some of the greatest challenges are at the state level. Every single state has its own regulations. No two states are exactly the same, and no two states really are the same. I mean, there are similarities among many states in terms of how it's structured, but definitions of ownership, definitions of financially interested party, what documents need to be submitted to a regulator for approval or notice or not at all, the timing for all that, who in the company is involved, who in the, let's say it's just a loan, right? I mean, in some states like New Jersey, they want to know who's providing loans and they want to see the loan documents. In others, you don't at all. Here's another one. When you have companies coming together or just people investing in the company, different states have limitations on number of licenses anyone can own. Some of them define it as a controlling share or more. Some of them define it as just a touch, just any percent, right? And maybe they make an exception for a public company. Maybe it's not even clear under their laws. These are just some of the examples of the strains of getting any deal at all, because you're talking about it often. Let me just make sure I'm clear on what the assumptions are here. You're dealing with a company that's doing business in more than one state, so it's affected by different state regulations, and that is an important assumption. And that you have some change in ownership or just the financial structure is part of that. And with that, you need to do a state-by-state analysis to determine how to work it with the state and even what the timing of approval is going to be, which has been a huge, both those factors, timing of approval and overlap of licenses, has been an enormous issue. Several deals have stuck out, have been held out for like 2 years on end, and I won't name any deals.
Sure.
It's just kind of unfair, but just kind of stuck out there because of these issues, which would not exist in really any other industry. I mean, there's some that are highly regulated, but this notion of state by state and even saying, is this person an owner? Literally is like a state by state analysis, which is
Yeah.
unusual because it's a word that has a lot of regulatory meaning and import. Just for folks who are less familiar, in large part because the states are trying to make sure that their state legal, state regulated operations are entirely legal except for the strain with federal law and run by legal people and not folks who are taking money in or out of organized crime or,
Hmm.
at this point, Russia and stuff like that.
Right, right. Wow, it's wild. Now, how about if a cannabis company gets a scale that they're ready to go public?
So let me just comment on one other thing, and I
Sure.
apologize for going back on your answer
No, no,
because
that's great.
it's what I just want to put an additional point on what I said. You then get into due diligence,
Hmm.
right? Due diligence of any companies, which isn't just are they following the cannabis laws? It's on everything. I don't you think of any, and it depends on like, if you're making a loan, that's up to you. I mean, any of it's up to you, but if you're purchasing a company, you sure want to put some effort into due diligence so you know what you're getting.
Yeah.
Um, Many companies have not fully realized that all the federal laws apply to them, employment laws, all of it. So there are issues around that, but there are also the state by state issues, right? So you're going in and seeing, is this company properly licensed? Are
Hmm.
they generally compliant? That means something different in each state. So, what we do for these kind of due diligence projects, we have teams in place that basically swoop in, right, with all this knowledge. You're not figuring it out on the fly. They know it, and they know what to look for in each state, and they swoop in, whether they're trademark lawyers or plant patent lawyers or employment lawyers, but the regulatory folks know this and swoop in and do the due diligence as well on that state by state basis to a certain degree.
Hmm.
And then we have like these, spreadsheets of red, orange, and green flags, which are common, but they have to take into account all of these issues,
Hmm.
all of the issues you would normally consider in any sort of a deal, plus all of these state issues and the, making sure they're properly mitigating any risk of federal enforcement as well.
Wow.
So I apologize. You wanted to talk a little about the Go Public
Yeah, exactly.
situation, which has been a fascinating area. So I just want to say there are two ways of looking at this. One is the Go Public on, for example, the Canadian Stock Exchange or the NEO, which has addressed US cannabis by saying we'll list companies, but they have to have full disclosures of all the possible risks of that. And we'll let the investors look at that and make their own choice. Well, that's very interesting. Let's talk a little bit more about how do companies, get listed on NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange or TSX, Toronto Stock Exchange, because, and I know the folks at CSE and NEO, and they've done wonderful things for this industry, and I think it's
Hmm.
great what
Hmm.
they've done. But most companies say, I want to go to the bigger boards. I want to get better access to capital.
Hmm.
Let me speak specifically about NASDAQ, and I've done a tremendous amount of work with them in particular. They are end use agnostic, meaning it's right there in their I think frequently asked questions, but they've said it to me. We don't care what business you're in. We don't cast moral judgment on any business, but what you do need to be, in addition to meeting all the liquidity and assets and investor um, requirements, which any company listing, you have to be compliant under all applicable law. You can't just be legally compliant under state law, they
Hmm.
say. You
Hmm.
need to be compliant under all applicable law. And if you're in a dicey area like cannabis, you need to basically prove that to us. The way that's normally done is through legal opinions. And we've done a whole bunch of them. We've probably done 8, 9 legal opinions now to help companies get listed. And the process is as follows. the company has to be able to say, we're not directly violating the Controlled Substances Act, meaning we're not trafficking in cannabis, right? We're not growing, we're not processing, we're not selling, we're not transporting. We're not indirectly violating the Controlled Substances Act. We're not aiding and abetting. We're not involved in a conspiracy to violate the Controlled Substances Act. While we're taking some money from the industry, we're not money laundering because we're doing it in this way. And so it's being able to explain all that to NASDAQ, which is a very, I'll say, one of the NASDAQ reps with whom I've dealt with for, I think, 5 years now, in a recent conversation, paused and said to me, "Why does every conversation with you feel like a law school exam?" And he meant it in a joking way, and we all laughed. But I mean, it is a little bit of that, right? It's really digging in deep and saying, what are the factors here, and what makes this different than someone that's actually trying to help the underlying company trafficking cannabis? And a loan, in many ways, is the more difficult side, right? Because you're providing money, and the way we've set that up for the REITs and the BDCs is it's just money, right? If you look at this is actually, if you'll and your viewers bear with me for a sort of geeky legal point, which is when I first took this and I hope this isn't a story out of tale out of school, but when I first took it to New York Stock Exchange, they said, wait a minute, they're providing money to the illegal business. That's why they exist, to give money to the illegal businesses. And I said, no, they exist to make money. They exist to make principal on their loans. And this is an area that they can do it. And it's just like anything else. They're just doing it just like they would it is in that sense, Agnès agnostic. It's no different than when you go into the hardware store and you buy some tubing. Are you going to use that in your grow? Are you going to use that in your bathroom? And I understand that this is their business and that's what's happening. But the trick was really to structure all of these companies in such a way that they're not doing certain things that companies in the space might do, which would be indicia of the underlying intent to traffic in cannabis. For example, we've had the issues of like who can sit on the board, can you have a board observer? You can have certain negative covenants, but where do the negative covenants go too far, such that you're exerting control on the underlying company? With the BDCs, the business development companies under the 40 Act, you have a very interesting issue that they have to at least offer managerial assistance. How do you offer managerial assistance without aiding and abetting? Well, that was what we had to figure out, right? What kind of managerial assistance? If you're just providing what we think of as back office services, maybe it's accounting, maybe it's just helping them find good insurance. All that's pro rule of law and has nothing to do with the trafficking of cannabis. It's at most helping them comply with state law. It certainly doesn't show the underlying intent to violate federal law in this area. And these are kind of nuanced arguments. And so when I explained all of that to NASDAQ, they said, but aren't they, to New York Stock Exchange, and this is kind of the point. They said, but wait a minute, aren't they charging the higher interest rates because it's illegal? I mean, they're profiting off of the illegality. And I said, no, not at all. They're charging the higher interest rates because they're super smart guys who figured out how to do it. And others have either not figured it out or don't have the risk tolerance to go figure it out. And it's simple supply and demand. There are fewer folks providing the loans, so they're able to charge the higher interest rates because they have figured out how to do it.
It's just like why our expected return is higher than a non-cannabis venture fund. It's the exact same situation.
That's exactly right. And do you have the actual intent? What is your intent in entering that contract? It's not actually to traffic in cannabis. You don't actually care if the cannabis is trafficked. In fact, you don't benefit from the upside. Now you do in the sense that like they need to make money to pay back your loans. But honest to God, you don't care how they do that. You just want your principal, the loan paid back and the principal. And now, of course, I should say, so that's for the public listing. It's not just the loans, it's anything. You take weed maps and you look at them and you say, they look like they're serving the cannabis industry. golly, you look like it even helps operators take orders, which it doesn't do. And so a lot of these are going into the company, positioning it correctly, but also structuring certain things around that, right? So if you're doing something for a reason, you can't go out to the public and say it's for another reason. So you have to clean that up. You have often kinds of structurings within the company or externally to the, other companies that might be plant touching that we sometimes have to do work on. And then we have to explain it. And when I say explain it, it's an opinion letter to NASDAQ, which is confidential. And I don't know that's privileged in that sense, but it's the highest level of confidentiality, and they don't share it with anyone. But you have to go explain it to other folks, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the bankers, even the auditors want to understand whether the company is legal or not. And so you have to be able to do it not just to satisfy one party, but to satisfy all the parties you get in. To be clear, these are not necessarily like legal opinions, and the structurings are not we 100% guarantee that no jury would rule against this, right? That's not what it is. It's a should rather than a will legal opinion. And so the process is working with the company, working with the other folks involved, and working with the public exchange to do all those things to, in the end, satisfy the public exchange, and in certain instances, SEC as well, and then implementing it. But it also is all the other things you have to do with public listings and that sort of thing, right? I mean, I can tell this without it being identifiable. Whereas one company, when they brought me in solely for this, right? They had their securities counsel, and I've now learned my lesson to look deeper. But it was one of the first ones, and they said, this is all good to go, and it came, and we did everything, and we got the blessing. And then they said, well, we don't have enough investors at this point, right? We need to rejigger that to make sure that we meet the threshold requirements for listing on NASDAQ. So it's the cannabis part, but it's everything else that's involved for that as well. Right. It's also just talking with the exchanges, right? And being trying to be helpful, right? I mean, trying to partner with them in a sense and not be an adversary, but keep them engaged and educated about the industry so they feel they're in a position to continue to analyze it. And I'll just call out the folks at NASDAQ have been very principled. I mean, there are times that they've really made me work hard and all that, but they've been practical and generally good to the companies that are trying to get there.
That's great to hear. And one of the things we were chatting about before we recorded, and you mentioned REITs, right, is kind of the interesting story of IIPR and them being the first one to list on the NASDAQ as a REIT, but then maybe the NASDAQ kind of changing their mind. So we'd love to hear a little bit more about that scenario.
Yeah, I'll tell you the story, which I think is fair game now. And I mean, I think it's enough public in a sense. And if I get it wrong in any way, someone can figure out how to get a hold of me and correct me. So if you look at the timing, IPR was going public during the 2016 presidential election. And an important context for this discussion is what we referred to back then as the Rohrabacher or Farr provision to the omnibus spending bill, which is now the Joyce Amendment or whatever it'll be this time, which says DOJ, you're not allowed to use any of this money to do anything that would interfere with a state medical cannabis program, state medical only cannabis program. Various federal appellate courts, including Ninth Circuit, and I think the Sixth Circuit as well, have ruled that that prohibition against the DOJ using any money to interfere with state medical programs includes prosecuting anyone who is in strict compliance with the state medical cannabis law. The prosecution of it in and of itself would be viewed as improperly interfering with the program. Other things could as well, but that specifically. IPR had, as I understand it, an agreement with the New York Stock Exchange that because this provision was in place, they would at that point only do deals in medical cannabis states with
Mm.
properly licensed medical cannabis operators. And here's the thing, here's the most important part. Everyone was assuming at that time that the Rohrabacher or Farr Amendment would be the floor, not the ceiling for cannabis reform going forward, because everyone was
Sure.
assuming that Hillary Clinton was going to win that election. And instead, Trump won the election. And shortly thereafter, appointed Jeff Sessions as Attorney
Mm.
General. And all of a sudden, everyone's like, well, what the heck do we do? And the decision was by everyone, we're going to go forward. I think, and I don't mean to put words in their mouth, but my understanding is New York Stock Exchange said we had made a deal. We had made certain assumptions that turned out not to be correct, but we gave them permission. And it would
Mhm.
be more damaging to reverse that position than to let them go forward. They let them go forward. I can tell you from my own experience in many of those years afterward, New York Stock Exchange was not interested in talking about cannabis. They're basically one and done and broken.
Interesting.
And I don't mean that. I mean, I don't, again, don't mean to put words in their
Sure.
mouth. It's more of a perception, but that certainly was clear to me that they were not interested at the beginning in kind of theories as to why a company is legal or not. They certainly are now, and they're interested now, but at that time, less so. And I guess there was maybe a feeling like they'd gotten burnt on that deal. But of
Oh,
course, regardless of that, it created a unique situation for IPR because they got to
mm,
list as an equity holding REIT. Basically, they hold the property. They hold the property, right? I mean, and they hold, I think some. I don't know if they hold equity in a company, but they hold the property is what I'm really getting at. When I say that, they own the property, and so that's what's illegal to do under the Controlled Substances Act. You can't own a
interesting.
property and knowingly permit it to be used for the trafficking of cannabis. And so the companies that eventually we were able to figure out how to get companies listed, REITs, but they don't own the property, and they
Oh,
never will own the property during while cannabis activity is occurring on it. So still, IPR has greater. They had a head start in raising capital. They have New York Stock Exchange, and they have greater leverage in some of these deals because even if it's not property holding, they can just go in and take the property and have it as their own.
wow. Interesting. Really interesting. And so, but then you said New York Stock Exchange by this point has allowed for more cannabis related businesses to list.
Less list. I know they're interested in finding a path forward or paths forward.
Well, that's good.
Um, we've seen a few that have popped up that have touched it, and I should be clear. Both exchanges have companies that are cannabis related, but they're not violating the Controlled Substances Act or any other federal law. Um, I don't mean to. I think it's just fair to say both of us have worked on a deal,
Mhm.
and I'm referring to Excess Financial.
Mhm.
And I haven't gone back, so I can't say it as of this date, but as of a certain date, like a couple of years ago, my view was they're a legal company.
Mhm.
They're operating legally and they didn't do it, but if they wanted to list publicly, they could list publicly. And on a
Mhm.
company like that, that's my opinion. Whether New York Stock Exchange would agree on that, I don't know for sure. I know NASDAQ would on
Mhm.
that particular, but then it depends what a company does afterward, right? If they start, and by the way, you see this in debt financing, where the companies that are not publicly listed, don't have their hand side, they can now go in and get the property and they can even take greater control or even take equity if they want. The
Mhm.
companies that are publicly listed, I don't want to say they can't. It's just very circuitous to be able to do that, and you lose
Yeah.
a ton of control and likely control of equity in that
Yeah.
process. So these are decisions to be made, right? As to how this all plays out. It's not like usually when you have your first child, couple, you're very focused on that childbirth. Folks tend not to think about like all parenting that goes beyond that. And with public listings, it's the same thing. It's not just getting listed, it's
Yeah.
remaining listed as well.
Right. I mean, it's just so interesting just talking to you. You're such a wealth of knowledge and just
Oh,
reinforces the
thank you. No, it's
fact.
great talking to you.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And it just reinforces the fact of how nothing in cannabis is easy, right? It's
Nothing is, I'll just say that. So you probably can tell I find this fascinating. And the fact that it's so weird is challenging, but it's a good challenge. I mean, it's a
yeah.
pain in the ass. I'm not saying like for a business point of view, I wouldn't wish it on anyone. And I'm sorry my clients have to deal with it, and all we can do is the best job we can. But it is interesting.
Mhm.
And it's super challenging. And I'll say the future is also really unknown, right? I mean, you just look at what's going on right now. I don't mean to digress too far here, Jordan, but we've talked all about the state legal, state regulated industry, if you will, and the fact that there are many different markets because they each stand alone and product isn't going from one to another. But you also have, I mean, it's more than that. You have an emerging federal legal market for research and development and export, and those are the ones who can do it. And from the FDA's announcements in the last couple of weeks and certain other things, it looks like the government is pointing, in that direction to a certain degree and wanting those folks to build out and all the testing on that. So you have that. You have hemp, which was just CBD, but now truly competitive, the
Mhm.
intoxicating isomer market, which is big, right? I mean, I'll tell you, I thought that that was going to get whacked down by the state
Yeah.
governments, and it hadn't entirely. And so
And you're
that's
talking about like
that
Delta 8 and that kind of thing?
Delta 8, Delta 10,
Hmm.
Delta O, Delta P. There's a whole bunch of them, and a lack of clarity on
Hmm.
both the federal and state level as to their legality. I have my own opinions, but I mean, under the current law and everything else, but there's all that ambiguity. And so you take those three markets that somewhat compete, somewhat don't, and like it's hard to know. We're all slaves of
Right.
politicians here, right? I mean,
The
either the
illicit
farm
market
bill.
too, right? You can't forget about
So
that.
I was going to say that you beat me
Yeah.
to the punch, and that's in
Yeah.
many ways the most important that you have. That's basically as large as all of those put together, the illicit market. And when we talk about any sort of deal, folks tend to look at the competitive landscape and think only or mostly about the state legal operators. But it's a very dynamic, kind of weirdly competitive market with different trigger points in there.
Hmm.
And so it really takes an understanding of what's happening in all those markets to even understand the legal landscape in one, uh, which is, again, I find fascinating, but is a headache for most folks.
Yeah, no, it's definitely definitely a headache for most, and certainly for the operators, right? Like just the competition from all these different streams when you've got the illicit market that isn't paying taxes and doesn't have to pay for all the compliance and testing costs, and it's naturally very difficult and frustrating for folks.
So let me, if you don't mind, comment on it, because I just find it, quite frankly, appalling, the folks who are standing in the way of our implementing the rule of law in the industry, right? I mean, how is it that, like, and I guess I won't name names today, but I mean, we know who they are, who say we can't have cannabis legalization, or we need to look at this longer. We need to spend more time, as if we live in a world where we have the choice of cannabis versus no cannabis.
Mhm.
We already have cannabis. We have billions of dollars, billions upon billions of illegal cannabis sold every year. And we have billions of state legal, and billions now of the hemp isomers. And to say, I don't want to implement the rule of law in this industry today is a
Mhm.
horribly irresponsible thing to say. And, and,
Totally.
and, and the folks who are standing in the way are the ones who claim to be law and order and all that. It's really perplexing. Um, and a significant problem moving forward. And the reason I say that is because uh, it's not really in, I mean, maybe someone, but not in the general public's interest to have an industry that's state by state by state.
Yeah.
There's really no, I mean, there are good reasons to do that for maybe a little bit of time and keep it rolling. Because, just to try to take time to figure it out and get it all implemented. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about like there should be no implementation or no time to figure it
Mhm.
out. But
Mhm.
like our country's built on uniformity and interstate commerce. I mean, that's our
Right.
strength
Right.
and and the rule of law. Like all three of those, and just not going to allow it for this industry because, for whatever reason, I refer to them as the game of Pop-A-Mole. I've been playing this for 14 years, where you go in and you say, so I was referring to this whole notion that I'm raising with you, that this is an industry deserving of the rule of law and all the other things that make America great,
Right.
and strong, have a strong economy. And and when you go and explain that to legislators who do not want this to happen because drugs are bad, um, we end up in a game of whack-a-mole that I've been playing now for 14 years, which is they express some concern that on its face seems like it may be, facially reasonable. And at least they can go tell their folks, well, I've raised this really serious issue, but they never are. They never have anything to really do with the decision of like, we have cannabis out there. Anyone can go purchase cannabis.
Yeah.
Should we regulate it or not? Right. And the things that are raised, like, well, we haven't quite worked out how to address intoxicated driving. And by the way, I'm raising one of the better arguments in opposition here. But what does that have to do with whether or not we should implement the rule of law
Right.
in this area? Right? We already have it. We inextricably have it. Decades. And no one is suggesting that there is a way to eradicate cannabis in the country unless we're going to do things like, just throw our constitution out the window
Right.
and have on-site execution, chop people's hands off, things like that. And even in those cultures, cannabis exists. So we're
Exactly.
not going to get rid of it. The question is, it's here. It's here to stay. How do we treat that? And so what my observation is for any of us, I had this in the latest rounds of the Bank Act. We got a list from Senator Grassley of his concerns with safe banking. Um, and I, quite frankly, and in all due respect, consider that part of the game of whack-a-mole, that they really had nothing to do with the notion of, you know, should we implement the rule of law here? Right. I mean, I had the notion of, oh, well, like states haven't shown that they've been able to totally control their programs because there's the illicit market in their states. Well, I mean, we're trying to get rid of that. And you're
Exactly.
standing in the way of us getting rid of
Safe
that.
banking
So
helps
don't
them
point to
reduce the
that
cost
as
so they can
like
outcompete them.
something defending your position. It makes no sense. And and in all due respect to that one person, is why I refer to this as whack-a-mole.
Yep. Yeah. No, I get it. And I think it gets back even to the whole history of the policy of the war on drugs. I mean, you take a sober look at the results, it's clearly not worked. It's clearly been far more destructive than beneficial, yet I think the harsh reality is that there are special interest groups who benefit greatly from the existing paradigm. And so maybe while those influences have a big hold on our politicians' decisions, that's not the excuse the politicians are gonna are gonna tell anybody because
Right, right,
once you
right.
hear that their campaign
They're
contributions
very good at that.
otherwise.
I mean, folks have been trained over their careers to do that, and to do lots of things, right? I mean, I have folks come out and say, oh, I just spoke to so-and-so and they told me that it's going to be this and this and this. And it's like politicians say that all the time. They don't keep
Yeah.
their promises. I don't mean all, I'm not like, I'm just saying it happens. And so the other thing I'd say in response to that and just the reality of where we are is share the observation now that I've been doing this for 14 years, something like that.
Yeah.
And every day is hand-to-hand combat.
Mhm.
You know, it may look great, like in that election that I referred to, the 2016 election. You may recall we had 8 out of 9 ballot initiatives pass. I mean, that was fantastic, right? I mean, that's a great day. But I mean, the work that goes into that, some states are easier than others, but it's a lot. And then it's not just about that, it's about actually the implementation of a program, right? I mean, look what's happening in Georgia, for example. Litigation upon litigation, um, fights over the rules, the draft rules, and everything like that, to be able to sell 5% THC cannabis, right? I mean, and so with the opponents, it takes a lot of time, and
Mhm.
some of them it's just leaving office, and even just getting executing on the programs is very difficult. And even the folks who are tasked with executing the programs, they usually turn into champions of the
Mhm.
program,
Mhm.
but not always. You have a lot of folks who are originally tasked with executing a program who have skepticism about it and don't think about how do I provide the best, safe, legal, affordable access to patients. They think of like, they think it, and I'm not, this is purely hypothetical. I'm not calling out anyone specifically here. They think of like, what are all the protections I have to put in place so that no cannabis from this, no 5% THC cannabis gets diverted from this program into the public? Well, in the public, anyone can get, illicit cannabis if they want,
Mhm.
right? So it makes no sense setting up
Mhm.
programs like that. Um, I don't mean like that. That's the choice of the people in the legislature. But to say here we are now, and we need to tighten it because we're worried that the 5% THC will escape the program,
Yeah,
and I mean it just kind
it's
of doesn't
crazy.
make that much sense, right?
Yeah.
And so this sort of effort on a daily basis to both combat people and then to work with people and help them understand the implications of these is just a lot, and it takes time.
Mhm.
It's possible when folks were looking at 2016 and thinking it was Hillary Clinton would get elected and it would happen more rapidly, it very well might have at that time. But at this time now, there's too much money. There are too many stakeholders on both sides, as you pointed out, and it's going to take time. And that's bad news where we are right now in the industry because there's some challenges.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I would say there's all sorts of different analogies for this, right? And we're in very, very early innings of
Yeah.
what's happening. And for that, I with no, not minimizing pain that people are in because the federal government has been dragging its feet. I would say to folks, don't, it's like if you're on vacation, don't let the traffic from the airport ruin your vacation, right?
Mhm.
There's a whole lot that's going to be going on afterward. And we're just going to have to deal with these challenges the way we've dealt with all of them, which is
Mhm.
hunker down and deal with them one at a time and convince people and keep a long horizon because not all of this happens in a day or a month or a year.
Yep, totally. Well, Eric, I could chat with you forever. There is
Likewise.
definitely there is definitely one last topic I'd like to ask you if you got a few more minutes.
Sure.
I think it would be great to chat about what's going on with the latest with Canopy and the recent announcement to potentially consolidate holdings with Acreage and some of the U.S. plant touching operations, and how that could potentially trickle through the rest of the industry if that's able to go through.
Yeah, so I need to be careful, of course, because these are ongoing discussions. So here's what I'll say. Um, there, a lot of folks have looked at what was published and interpreted as like a hard no, or there's just a lot of misinformation.
Yeah.
And
And
I'll
could you
say
give
that,
folks a little bit of background on what the situation
yeah, I'm
is?
sorry. That's exactly
Yes.
right. People wouldn't have a clue. Can you hold, can we put like us on hold for a
Yeah,
second?
for sure.
Can we,
Let's go.
so yeah, we'll go back on. So let me first start off with an explanation of when I refer to the Canopy deal, what that's referring to. Um, and these statements aren't looking to trump others. So if someone's kind of looking for real reliance, this is just a casual conversation I'm having with you, and there are risk disclosures and everything else out there. But Canopy Growth, the a large Canadian licensed producer and international company that is listed on NASDAQ, had all sorts of future contingent rights in companies. Wana, Jetty, Acreage are the three biggest, and and they had difficulties in just managing it and just all those sort of things. So what they have done is have a transaction with a company that's called Canopy USA, CUSA. And CUSA is going to become basically a holding company, over time for those other companies. And Canopy Growth, in the simplest way, sold their rights to those companies to Canopy USA in exchange for what we refer to as exchangeable shares. So they have, it's an odd situation. Canopy Growth has no, they can't kind of come in and dictate what Canopy USA is doing on a day-to-day basis. They legally, under NASDAQ laws, would only be able to trigger the exchangeable shares when federally legal or when NASDAQ gives permission. And if they do it sooner than that, they risk delisting. There have been issues with NASDAQ as to, originally Canopy said we want to consolidate the financial statements of these other entities because it's moving up into this company that we have these large exchangeable shares in. And it's not a matter that we can control them. It's not the lawyer's perspective that should be done. It's the accountant's perspective. And NASDAQ objected to that. NASDAQ said, we don't want the business of the US plant touching companies to be consolidated up in Canopy. That is what all the parties are discussing. Unless you're releasing this tomorrow, by the time you release this, there will be an additional filing that will have some additional clarification. So I can't get out ahead of it today.
Sure.
Other than to say that all the parties that are involved, stakeholders in this, have worked in earnest to try to find a way to hold the NASDAQ listing. And, I'm reasonably hopeful that'll happen at the end of the day.
That's great. That's great. And did TSX already give their approval?
The TSX has already given their approval. Yeah.
That's great. So do you think that this could clear a pathway for either A, other Canadian LPs to do a similar structure, or B, maybe publicly listed cannabis ancillary businesses would look to do something similar with plant touching businesses?
So potentially, I don't think it's the complete open door that some originally perceived, because you have to have the company to list to begin with, right? You can't list just on the exchangeable shares. So if you just have a company and their only asset is the exchangeable shares, I'm not sure that's good enough for like liquidity and everything else. So you need kind of that wholly legal business that would be big enough. And then on top of that, you're going to need to make this all work. So I think there are a few companies that would be able to do it. My sense sitting here is that NASDAQ is unlikely to let them consolidate their financials if that's one of the goals of doing it. And so we'll just have to see, in light of that, what kind of capital would come in. But the short answer is, I think it's possible, but on a limited scale.
Got it. Well, Eric, thanks again. I've just learned so much during this conversation.
Thank you for your questions. It's really great talking with you, Jordan, as always. And And this is interesting. I know you and I could go on the rest of the afternoon, but I guess we'll get back to our day jobs. But it's really great talking to you. And it's such a fascinating area with so much change happening. And I'll
Yeah.
tell you, when I get on a call like this for an hour, where I'm just, dialed into the call, I like get a little nervous because we exist in an industry where like truly something could have happened during that time. Like if you're just an antitrust lawyer, you're not going to have anything that's like breaking news during that period of time, or you might know it, or like, these other areas, but literally like things happen quickly here, which is both,
Yeah.
causes some white knuckling, but is also really interesting.
Yeah, definitely interesting. And, we'll have to hop back on it sometime soon. I know we got some other fun ongoing projects, so maybe we can
Yeah.
talk about them in the future too.
Yeah, and I'm around. I'll look forward to that, Jordan. I'll let you go, but thank you, and thank you for the extra time, and great talking with you. This has been fun.
You too, my friends.
All
Have a
right,
great
take
rest of
care.
the
Look forward to
afternoon.
talking soon. Bye bye.
Yeah, cheers.